I am delighted and privileged to be joined by 4 of the grant recipients from the 2021 AccessLex Institute and Association for Institutional Research, Research and Dissertation Fellows Grant Program. The AccessLex AIR grant was created in 2015 to encourage academic and empirical inquiry into issues of access, affordability, and value within graduate and professional education. We'll hear from each fellow about their research shortly. But before we begin, I would like to invite each panelist to introduce themselves. So Krista, Willis, Nick, and when Kelly is available, she'll join as well. Please share your name, your role, your institution, and where you're joining us from today. So we can start with Krista.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is and I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Student Affairs Assessment at the University of Minnesota. I also hold a couple of other roles as the Assistant Director for Research and Strategic Partnerships with the CERU Research Consortium, which I will talk about today. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, I'll jump in next. Hello, everybody. My name is Willis Jones. I am an Associate Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at the University of South Florida. And I am actually coming to you today from Nashville, Tennessee, where I believe the conference would have been anyway. So very excited to share my work with you today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. My name is Nick Bowman. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Mary Louise Peterson Chair in Higher Education and Director of the Center for Research and Undergraduate Education at the University of Iowa, and I'm joining you here from Iowa City.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And it looks like Kelly's having a little bit of trouble joining us, so I will give her just one more moment to join in, and then we'll kick off with presentations. But actually, while we do that, I'll go ahead and give Krista an opportunity to kick off with her slides while we're giving Kelly some time to log in. And as soon as she joins us, we'll allow her to introduce herself. So Krista, your time starts now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. And thank you so much for the support and funding of our research as well. Today I'm going to be talking about the role of financial factors, and I'm going to focus specifically on the role of financial factors for law students, although our greater project is much bigger in terms of its scope, which I will share in my presentation. So I'm going to share our research questions, talk a little bit about the CERU Consortium, which is where we received our data, provide details on the sample, my methodology, and the results. So the overarching research questions for this entire study is there a relationship between graduate, professional, and law students' financial variables, which include their sources of financial support and financial stressors, and their mental health. So their odds of experiencing clinically significant major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, their projected time to degree, and their career interests, controlling for additional factors. Although some of these topics are not as relevant within the legal studies community, so consequently for today's presentation, I'm really narrowing my focus quite a bit. So I'm looking at the relationship between law students' financial hardships and their mental health. So the odds of experiencing clinically significant generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder symptoms, controlling for additional environmental, demographic, and climate factors during the pandemic. So we administered a really large survey at 10 large public research universities, which included a pretty sizable sample of law students. And so I thought I would analyze that particular group of folks for today's conversation. As my conceptual framework, I used Fink's integrated model of mental health, and Fink described the role of individual factors like demographics, interpersonal factors like sense of belonging, and then institutional factors. Fink's model did not examine financial stressors or financial hardships, which is what I will be doing today. So the Student Experience in the Research University, or CERU Consortium, is a group of top-tier research-intensive universities, and we collaborate by administering the surveys as census surveys to all of our students on a regular schedule. We share the data, we benchmark the data, and we provide best practices across our institutions. And we also seek paths for institutional self-improvement. We've got over 30 large public research universities in the U.S. who participate in the CERU Consortium. We're also an international consortium with a large number of institutions that participate worldwide as well. we've got 3 primary surveys. One is for undergraduates, one is for graduate students, and we just developed a postdoc SERU as well. So today I'm going to be talking about the results from the grad SERU. Our overall goals are to really examine the tripartite mission of research universities, so teaching, public and community engagement, and research and knowledge production. And it looks like there's a few errors on this particular slide. Not sure what happened there, my apologies. But we developed our survey in response to the pandemic. We couldn't sort of offer a traditional survey last spring semester. So we developed a survey specific to students' experiences during the pandemic. It had 5 big areas: academic experiences, specifically obstacles in the transition to remote instruction, financial hardships, belonging and engagement, health and well-being, and future plans. And we developed the survey to be actionable, short, mobile-friendly, cost-effective, and to provide benchmarking. So as I mentioned, we had 10 large public research universities who participated in this administration. The response rates from May to July were about 13 to 41%, depending on the institution. I'm proud to say the University of Minnesota Graduate School was that 41%. So we usually do pretty well in terms of our survey responses. We had over 34,000 undergrads and 17,000 graduate students, but today I'm going to focus on a sample of 644 students who are in that sort of legal studies law degree bucket. I won't go into detail about the sample, but you'll be provided access to the slides at the end of the presentation. Just for context, I provided this information on those 644 students. With regards to my methods, I used effect coding for all of the relevant variables, particularly among the demographic variables, and I engaged in some multivariate logistic regression, predicting essentially the odds of experiencing those clinically significant symptoms of major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. For major depressive disorder, we use the PHQ-2, which is a well-known and validated instrument of major depressive disorder, and the G82, which is the well-known instrument for generalized anxiety disorder. Both of these don't necessarily diagnose major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, but they can be used along with other diagnostic tools to help clinicians to determine whether or not a person may be experiencing one of these 2 mental health disorders. For my independent variables, I looked at gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, citizenship, disability status, parents' education, social class, caregiver status, and age. For the climate variables, I looked at campus climate results. So we asked students whether they felt supported, whether they feel like they belong, if they feel valued as an individual. For the financial variables, we asked students whether they had experienced we had a big list of financial hardships, and these were the biggest among those lists. And the percentages of students who indicated yes, the percentages of law students who indicated yes, are shown on this particular slide. I also looked at some additional items. We used a 2-item screener for food insecurity and a 2-item screener for housing insecurity, and then some measures of employment that might have been sort of more characteristic of law students' experiences. For instance, whether they worked as a research assistant. We also asked students if they worked as a teaching assistant. That was a really small proportion of law students, so I didn't include it. These are the items for food and housing insecurity, which again will be available on the slide. So what did I find? So the models had pretty decent overall fit for major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. Within the generalized anxiety disorder group, we saw that cisgender men actually had reduced odds of experiencing these clinically significant generalized anxiety disorder symptoms compared to their peers. Gay or lesbian students also had clinically significant reduced symptoms. And that's something that we don't traditionally find in the research. That's a really interesting result. Bisexual students, though, were almost 2 times as likely as their peers to experience these clinically significant symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. Students who had neurodevelopmental or cognitive disabilities, almost 2.5 times more likely to experience these generalized anxiety disorder. When students felt supported by their institutions during the pandemic, they had reduced odds of generalized anxiety disorder. And when they lost an expected job or internship, they lost it or it was canceled because of the pandemic, they were also much more likely to experience generalized anxiety disorder, as were students who had unexpected increases in living expenses. We found that straight students had reduced odds of major depressive disorder compared to their peers, as did gay or lesbian students. Again, that's something that we don't traditionally find in the literature. Bisexual students over 2.5 times more likely to experience these symptoms of major depressive disorder. Caregivers were much less likely to experience major depressive disorder if they were caregivers for children, but law students who were caregivers for adults were almost 2.5 times more likely to experience these clinically significant symptoms. And students who cared for both kids and adults, almost 5 times more likely. I know I'm running out of time. I'll end on this slide. Students with physical disabilities, over 4 times, almost 5 times more likely. Students who felt supported, less likely to experience major depressive disorder. And students who experienced housing insecurity, almost twice as likely to experience major depressive disorder, as were students who had unexpected increases in living expenses. I'll end with some policy recommendations that I'll just toss on the slide, and I'd be happy to take some additional questions from folks once we walk through, once we walk through the rest of the presentations. Thanks so much for your time, folks.
Thank you, Krista. Willis?
All right, looks like I'm next. So hello, everyone. Again, thank you all so much for the opportunity to present my research, and thank you, AccessLex, for this opportunity to present. So the title of my presentation is Examining the Determination, Consistency, and Variation of Law School Cost of Living Estimations. And what I want to do over the next 8 minutes is just give you a broad overview of the study that I'm doing. Is still in the early stages, but I want to give you a broad overview of what I'm hoping to do with this study. And also talk, and because we have a pretty compressed time, 8 minutes here, I'm going to go through things a little bit faster than I normally would, but certainly if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the chat. So this study is really grounded in the growing cost of law school over the last 20 years or so. So since the year 2000, the overall cost of law school has increased about 126%. At public law schools, that increase has been about 261%. And typically when that the growing cost of law school can have a number of significant detrimental impacts on things like student loan debt, as well as access to law school. So typically when we think about law school costs, we focus on tuition and fees. That's kind of the first thing that the general public, I think, goes to when they are commenting on the cost of higher education in general, and certainly the cost of law school. However, if you want to get a full picture of the cost of going to law school, you also have to take into account living expenses. And these are broadly defined as really everything that it costs to go to law school outside of the tuition and fees. So things like housing, personal care, transportation, and so on and so forth. Now, every law school, every ABA-approved law school is expected to publish their estimated living expenses as part of their required disclosures. And if you take a look at those, you start to see that they can be a pretty sizable portion of the total cost of going to law school. So a couple of examples here. At the University of Arkansas, you have about, total cost is about $32,000 per year. 46% of that is tuition, about 54% of that is living expenses. At Vanderbilt Law School, the total cost of attendance is around $87,000. About $60,000 of that is tuition and fees, but another $26,000 comes in the form of living expense estimations. Now, there are a couple of things that you should know about cost of living estimations. Number one, these estimations are not standardized across law schools. So different law schools will include very different variables, different ways of measuring transportation, different ways of measuring personal costs, and so on and so forth. So that's not standardized across law schools. There's also very little oversight when it comes to estimated living expenses. Certainly a lot less oversight, I would argue, than what you would typically see when it comes to tuition and fees, the tuition and fee portion of the total cost of going to law school. So because of this, there's been some concern that law schools are publishing slightly inaccurate living expense estimations. In the full proposal, I actually go into a lot more detail as to what the motivation would be for law schools to do this, but for the sake of time, I won't get into that too much. So this potential inaccuracy is really what's driving my project here. And one of the questions that you may be asking yourself is, well, why do we care about the accuracy of law school published estimated living expenses, given the fact that most law schools very clearly state to students that these estimations are just that, they're estimations, and every individual has different circumstances that could increase or decrease the amount of non-tuition and fee money that it costs to go to college? Well, I would make two arguments there. One is that these estimated living expenses can impact the overall sticker price of law school, which can influence a student's perception of their ability to pay. This can be especially true for students of color and other minoritized groups. Second, I would argue that the estimated living expenses that are published, those determine the amount of student loan eligibility that a law student is eligible, the amount of money that a law student is eligible to take out in student loans. And that can be impactful in one of two ways. If law schools are overestimating how much it actually costs to attend, then you could find yourself in a situation where student debt is higher than it should be. On the other hand, if law schools are underestimating how much it costs, then it may lead to law schools having an inability to pay for the basic necessities of law school. So that's really what's driving this project. There are three research questions that this project is looking at. The first one is, what processes do law schools use in determining their institution's estimated living expenses? And to answer this question, I'm going to be submitting in January 2021 a survey of deans of admissions at ABA-approved law schools. So a quick aside, if you happen to be on this presentation and you are a associate dean or dean of admissions and you happen to get an email from somebody from the University of South Florida in January, please take about 10 minutes to complete the survey. It would be really, really helpful. The second research question asks, to what extent are published living expenses consistent with cost of living estimations based on local data? And to give you a sense of what that looks like, what that will look like at the University of Kentucky, published law school expenses are about $18,778. My goal is to take data from a wide variety of sources and come up with my own estimate of how much it would cost for a single individual living in Lexington, Kentucky, to go to live within that city for 9 months, however long. And so let's just assume that's $21,000 in total. Well, that difference is what I'm interested in. And I want to calculate that difference for every law school and get a sense of what that looks like across law schools across the country. The final research question is going to be focused on looking at if there are those gaps between the published estimation and the estimate and the cost of living estimate that I come up with using third-party data. I want to see if institutional characteristics like enrollment size, location, or institutional control can help explain some of that difference. So I have a little bit of preliminary data. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here just for the sake of time, and I want to talk about the story of DC. And this kind of illustrates why I think this is a really interesting question. You have 5 law schools in the DC area, and you would generally expect that those law schools would have very similar published estimated living expenses, given where they're all located within a few mile radius of each other. However, if you take a look at this data, you see that there can be pretty wide disparities in those published living expenses. And that's really what I'm interested in investigating, why that is the case. And if we can better understand what are the challenges that law schools face when it comes to making some of those calculations. So thank you for your time. And as I said at the beginning, please in the chat, put any questions you may have, and I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Willis. I think we're on to Nick now.
Thank you all for joining us here today. And thank you in particular for AccessLex for supporting this work. Like Willis, I unfortunately don't have final results today as we're in kind of the late stages of combining a bunch of different data sources and creating consistency on a bunch of different variables across years here. So to start off, to give us a little bit of an overview of this issue in general, if we're thinking about representation by race at law schools, there's actually the same statistic for both of these values, that 31% of incoming law students and 31% of recipients of JDs are people of color, according to the most recently available data by the American Bar Association. To give you a little bit of baseline of what that number could be, 40% of people in the US are people of color, and also that tends to skew higher among younger folks. So if we're thinking about people who are in their earlier mid-20s, that would be higher than 40%. However, I'd argue that the statistic that we're really to care about is the representation of active attorneys in the US for a couple of different reasons. One, as a field, thinking about having a profession that can adequately represent the people that are served within the US population here. It's also important from the student perspective that many students have the potential of going to law school and not actually entering the profession, that's going to result in the highest pay. And as a result, if these students take out a lot of loan debt, can be particularly problematic. So thinking about who it is that active attorneys are in the US. And unfortunately, those statistics look nothing like our population as well. I mean, it's shocking 85% of all active attorneys are white or Caucasian. And both of these data sources are available over time. So if you look at the last 7 to 10 years, to what extent there are changes, that both when we're thinking about students, JD recipients, and attorneys, are becoming more racially diverse. But at the same time, this hasn't been a huge change, and there's certainly a long way to go. So thinking more about exploring and doing some research around this issue, I was actually surprised as we've looked into some of this, how little work has been done on dynamics that shape racial composition in law schools. There's some work on graduate and professional schools more generally. As one notable exception here, this Espelon and Sauter study showed that from an admissions standpoint, some admissions officers perceived tension between, the representation of students and, the sorts of LSAT and GPA indicators in their law school. And there's a concern, that, oh, well, if we, have a more racially diverse class, what will that do, for our LSAT and GPA scores and therefore our rankings, which is, certainly a notable barrier for diversification as institutions are making these decisions about admission and financial aid packages. So the two main things that we're looking at, and I'll talk in a little bit about why these are framed in terms of changes, but basically like looking at, the factors or the attributes, the reasons why, some law schools will have more or fewer racially minoritized students who initially enroll, as well as looking at, the factors that explain graduation among racially minoritized students. So to give you a bit of idea on some of the literature that informs this work, there's a lot of work, some in law school, but a lot in thinking about undergraduates on financial aid. And Willis already did a great job of talking about the problems of what happens with overborrowing versus underborrowing, and the fact that both of these are problems. The research at undergraduates shows substantial benefits in terms of completion of degree, of receiving grants or scholarships, or basically funding that people don't have to repay. There's actually one study that looked at financial aid among law students with minoritized identity, found some unclear results about the benefits of that. It's also important, we're pointing out, as Willis noted already, that some of these dynamics among aid and transparency really disadvantage students of color. In the sense that students of color are more likely to take out loans as a result, and are less likely to be able to have access to the sorts of information that would allow them to make, optimal decisions. There's also a lot of work pertaining to rankings here as well, and I mentioned this Espelon and Sauter study that showed, this potential tension that institutions might be wrestling with when trying to maximize these. There's also work, that shows this disparate use of rankings by groups that tends to be white, more affluent students are the ones who are more likely to use rankings. This is actually work that primarily, again, focuses on undergraduates. There's less on law school specific settings. We're looking at the institutional data over time. We've got 9 years worth of data from a whole bunch of different information on APA disclosures. We have data on the U.S. News rankings, and we also have data on the U.S. Census, looking at the representation of people in the communities in which these law schools are housed. So overall, our final sample, again, sort of has these 9 observations for each institution, and we only used data in which we had, or institutions in which we had data on all 9 schools. We also, for any schools that, like merged during this time or went, no longer were a law school during this time, we excluded them from the sample. So looking at some of our measures, our key outcomes are looking at this percent of incoming students of color, which we define first broadly, and then we create several more narrow groups, looking at underrepresented racial minority students, so excluding Asian American students. Then we have for Asian, Black, and Latinx students. We also have estimated, unfortunately, it was only a couple of years ago or a few years ago, in which graduation rates for law schools were reported separately by racial ethnic group. And so we have to come up with an estimation of graduation rate for students of color, as well as looking at the number of graduates of color from each institution. So these predictors, we have multiple measures of each of these, looking at, admissions, enrollment data of who's enrolling, how many people are enrolling, looking at packages that are offered and received, looking at tuition and other costs that students earn, including institutional characteristics that might change over time. So the analyses, because there's a lot of factors that shape these between institution differences. So the main analyses that we're looking at is to basically account for all between institution variation. And we're only looking at changes in institutions over time. Because in some way, this is our research question of interest or phenomenon of interest. We really want to know, if institutions did something differently, would they be able to diversify their incoming cohorts among students of color? It's also important, to think about how much to lag that time as well. The fact that, institutional characteristics that are happening, say, when students are entering college are important, when predicting whether or not they'll go in the next year. We're also going to look, random effects models as a type of model that looks simultaneously at sort of this within institution variation, because we're not sure yet whether there's enough within institution variation to model. And I wish I had results for you. We're very excited at what we might find, and we want to thank you all for your time.
Well, I want to end by thanking all of you, Kelly, Krista, Willis, and Nick. Thank you again so much for joining us today.